Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, sir. FT49, before lunch we were discussing the mechanism of Novichok poisoning and we had got to the point of the irreversible nature of organophosphate agents, the impact they have on acetylcholine esterase, and you were telling us that different agents within that class had that impact at different speeds. And that is something we'll come back to in the context of treatment. And so I'd like, if I may, to move on now to a different topic, but another one that is covered in your slide pack, which is the history of Novichok, or Novichoks plural. And that is something that I will try and take fairly briefly because it's something we'll come back to with at least one more witness later in the inquiry. But if we may, if we could go within the slide pack, which is 004691 to page 15, please. And you'll see, FT49, this is a slide headed First Report of Novichoks. And we see in the text underneath that following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were various pieces of information and reports that came out from within the former Soviet Union by which Western governments and indeed the Western public became aware of these details of the former Soviet Union's chemical weapons program. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. There were open reports in the 90s from primarily a dissident by the name of Muzanyanov, who reported that there'd been a Russian nerve agent program, which included the class Novichoks, yes. and that program was called the Foliant program.
Thank you. And if we go over to the next of the slides, we can see there a list of three individuals who were the sources, or some of the sources of this information. But as you say, the first one there, Dr. Muzanyanov. Sorry, how do we?
Muzanyanov.
Yeah. And looking at the first bullet point underneath, was he someone who had actually been involved in this program at an earlier time?
In a number of publications that he wrote, he claimed that he'd been part of that program, yes.
Yes, and you're right to give that answer because there is some controversy about that, is there not?
Indeed.
And then if we go to the next slide, please. You've mentioned the word foliant. Was that the name that was given in these reports to the program that these individuals described?
Yeah, that's correct. In the reports, it termed the nerve agent program as under a collective code name of Foliant program.
And looking
that's thought to be the Russian code.
I'm not entirely sure about that, sir.
That's what's being said.
Yes, yeah,
right.
that's what was claimed, sir.
That was what was claimed. Yeah. Yes, quite.
And we're clearly taking this quite quickly, and there are subtleties that we are missing as we go. But looking at the first bullet point, the 3 lines down, the program, that is what we've just described as the program which it is said was named Foliant. The program was conducting research into a new class of nerve agents called Novichoks, which broadly is translated here as newcomers. We sometimes hear it called new chaps or new guys.
Yes, correct. And sometimes termed fourth generation nerve agents.
And that is why, although we often see the word Novichok in the singular, correctly, it describes a class of different agents. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. As with all organophosphates, they are chemically similar, but the Novichoks per se, again, are a collective class that have a similar chemical structure.
And just carrying on looking at the first bullet point, the reports, that is from Dr. Mirzianov and others, claimed that these new nerve agents, the Novichoks, were synthesized from quite considerably before the time that these publications were happening, back in the 1970s. But was the claim that that was a program that had been ongoing, or that it had just happened in the 1970s and then stopped?
The only information that we had is up to the date of when Mirzianov was openly stating that the program was active, which I believe in the mid-90s was some statements in his book.
Yes. And there's in fact, if we go over to the next page, this is the last, I think, well, no, actually the last but one slide I'm going to show you. There's a reference to Mirzianov himself. So it's page 18, please. Yep. A paper that he produced in 1995, and then a book, which I think it's fair to say sort of repeated and perhaps expanded on what was in some of his earlier literature, published in 2009.
Indeed, it's an extensive book of many pages, and at that time as well there were other open source literature publications from academic institutions being published at that time.
But certainly by the time he published his book in 2009, he had been living outside the former Soviet Union, Russia, for many years.
Correct.
And what he was describing was things that had happened in the late 20th century.
That's correct, yeah.
There was one more page I wanted to take you to, and that's page 20, please. And you see the heading goals. The first of those goals, and are these goals, this is your pack, what you understand or assess to have been the goals of this Foliant programme?
That's correct. From the open source information that was available, the Foliant programme had been an attempt to circumvent Western medical countermeasures and principles in place for our protection.
And does this derive again from the claims made by the people you described as the whistleblowers? Or is it broader than that?
In the open source literature, those claims are made.
Are made, right, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
So just to, in a little bit more detail, the first of the bullet points describes an attempt, a goal to compromise defensive countermeasures. Does that, is that in essence a new nerve agent which might be more difficult to treat than earlier generation nerve agents?
Yes, I think collectively those efforts were to find a difficult or a more challenging way to identify poisoning and also to treat it.
And the second bullet point seems to be addressing something rather different, an attempt to disguise the precursors of the agent in the pesticide industry. Can you expand on that for us?
Yeah, so again, this points pretty more directly actually to Mirzianov's claim that they were attempting to hide the Foliant program within a routine pesticide industry.
So that's the
so the actual production of a Novichok. Yeah.
I see. So in the large-scale production of these military nerve agents disguised within normal sort of civilian plants.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
I see. Thank you. Well, as I say, we may come back to some of those points with other witnesses, but that's all I wanted to ask you about that, particularly because these were your slides, FT49. Let me move on to a different subject, please, and that is the question of the lethality of Novichoks. Now, we've heard references in the course of the hearings, obviously to Novichok being extremely lethal. We've heard reference, for example, to that small bottle of perfume with which we're all familiar, potentially being capable of killing hundreds or even thousands of people. I want to ask you about what you say in your witness statement on this general area. And that, if we could go, please, so to your statement, that's 005997, page 2. And paragraph 8. Thank you. And if we look at the second sentence of that paragraph, FT49, it reads as follows. The toxicology properties of Novichok mean this nerve agent is highly potent and is considered to be similar to the well-characterized nerve agent VX. We do not have specific data on the human lethal dose of Novichok following exposure via the percutaneous route, that is through the skin. As such, studies are unethical. As such, extrapolation needs to be made from animal experimental data, as is the case for many toxic substances. So is the position, FT49, then, that if we are trying to talk about the lethality of Novichok, the sort of most secure way of doing that is by comparison to VX, which is a much older nerve agent where more data exists?
Yeah, that's correct. There's a lot more data on VX with which you can extrapolate information about Novichoks.
Yeah.
However, noting open source claims that the Novichoks are more potent. So it's VX plus.
Yeah. So if we then look down at paragraph 9, with that in mind, you provide some sort of hard detail about VX. You say the calculated human lethal dose of VX is in the order of 10 milligrams on skin, which is equivalent to 8 or so grains of sand. And that's quite a graphic way of describing it, a really tiny amount.
Yes, it's a very small amount and incredibly difficult to identify.
And as you say, and in fact, this is how you go on in the next sentence, noting the sort of public claims that Novichok is even more lethal than VX. It follows, if that were right, then an even smaller amount could be fatal. Is that fair?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's fair.
Thank you. I'd like then to move on to another area, although closely related to the ones we've already been discussing, which is the question of treatment of Novichok poisoning, in particular with drugs. And we were just discussing the history of Novichoks, and perhaps one of the purposes of this new generation of nerve agents being to make them more difficult to treat. We presumably should bear in mind that they were designed as a weapon, and it is an obvious advantage of a weapon if it's difficult to treat in its victims.
Yeah, that would be the case.
And what we see from your statement about the different drugs is that there is no simple antidote. One imagines sort of classically, I don't know, if you're bitten by a snake and it's fortunate enough there to be some sort of anti-venom for that particular snake bite, you take it, you get better. That's easy. There's nothing remotely similar for Novichok poisoning, is there?
That's correct. There's no directed specific therapy for Novichok or any other nerve agent for that matter. Our best medical interventions are a collection of therapies.
Yes. A collection of therapies, and we'll talk about them in a little detail, but at a high level, is it right to say that the different medications tackle that collection of symptoms in different ways?
Yeah, that's correct. There's a number of different targets in that cholinergic toxidrome that you can help to reverse the effects.
I think it would be useful now if we would look at another one of your slides. So it's 004691, please, and page 42. And FT49, what I think you describe in this slide is two different types of drugs, two groups of drugs perhaps, which, as we've just said, combat the sort of toxidrome of symptoms that a Novichok victim might suffer in different ways. Is that right? And the two different groups being anticholinogenics on the one hand and oximes on the other.
Yeah, that's correct. They're the two mainstays of early therapy once you've identified an organophosphate.
So if we can just spend a few minutes discussing the difference between the two types of drugs, and we'll talk about how they're applied and what their limitations are and how they were used in the cases we're thinking about. Starting with the anticholinergics, how do they work? How do they go about tackling the toxidrome?
So you may recall from Dr. Haslam's evidence yesterday of his description of the parasympathetic nervous system. Within that parasympathetic nervous system, there are cholinergic synapses where that acetylcholine is at very high levels. Hence, you get those clinical effects. With atropine, what you're trying to do is stop that acetylcholine having those effects by blocking a receptor, a signaling receptor on the muscle or the organ tissue where those bad effects are happening. And one of those receptors is muscarinic receptors, and the atropine helps to block the overaction of acetylcholine at those receptors.
Yeah. So if we were talking before lunch, broadly speaking, the problem following Novichok poisoning is that build-up of acetylcholine.
Yeah.
These drugs try and block the effect of that build-up. And you've mentioned one of those drugs, which is atropine.
Yeah.
As we will recall, that was a drug that was given to Sergei Skripal, albeit by mistake, also to Charlie Rowley. And is it right that has a particular association with dealing with the heart issues and trying to improve the heart rate?
Well, so that atropine will act to any tissue in your body where there are muscarinic receptors and there is that overstimulation by acetylcholine. So that could be things like helping to reduce secretions, helping to increase heart rate, for instance.
So it's a number of things, including the heart.
Yeah, yes, completely.
So that's atropine blocking the actions of excess acetylcholine in that sense. What about hyoscine? That's also, according to your slide, one of these anticholinergics?
Yes, so hyoscine hydrobromide is a drug that's used in palliative care, so for people who are at the end of life and have large amounts of secretions that might need controlling. Hyoscine acts through a very similar mechanism, blocking muscarinic receptors, but it's slightly different to atropine in that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and can have positive effects in your brain as well. So by, for example, reducing the likelihood of seizure activity. The other good thing about hyoscine is it has what we call a very long half-life, so it can act for a long period of time, whereas atropine has quite short-term effects. And in combination, they are a very effective strategy to reduce those high levels of acetylcholine.
So we've heard evidence, then going back to the facts of our cases, we've heard that both Sergei and Yulia Skripal were in hospital for an extended period of time. Were they both treated with these drugs as a sort of an ongoing treatment in an attempt to combat their symptoms in the different ways that you've described?
All of the patients were treated. That includes Sergei, Yulia, Nick Bailey, Dawn, and Charlie were all treated with hyoscine hydrobromide once identification of their exposure was there.
Yes, and not just the hyoscine, but also atropine?
And atropine, yes.
Yeah. Not because, as we said, it's going to immediately solve the problem, but an attempt to keep the symptoms at bay. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, and and ultimately improve long-term outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the anticholinergics, as you said, at the receptors, trying to block the effect of the excess acetylcholine. Then we have the oxime, and of course we've heard already something about pralidoxime chloride. Yeah. It's also on your slide as a treatment, but it works in a rather different way, does it not?
It does indeed.
And we'll come to its limitations in a minute, but in principle, how can it work in these sorts of cases?
So for a number of organophosphates and nerve agents, pralidoxime is able to reactivate the enzyme that the nerve agent is bound to. So the oxime gets into the middle of that enzyme and levers off, for want of a better word, the organophosphate chemical that's bound there, doing its bad job. And pralidoxime and other oximes can effectively regenerate the enzyme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So whereas the hyoscine and the atropine are trying to block the effect of the build-up of acetylcholine, is it an oversimplification to say that, in theory, the pralidoxime should reactivate the inhibited acetylcholine esterase, yeah, which once reactivated will itself break down the excess acetylcholine?
Correct. So you're trying to almost restart the engine, yeah, because it's maybe a good analogy that that engine's ticking along acetylcholinesterase most of the time, clearing the acetylcholine from that location. And yeah, when the nerve agent's there, the engine obviously stops. With the pralidoxime, you can attempt to restart that engine.
And we heard, particularly in the evidence in Salisbury from the first responders, that the standard treatment which is issued to first responders in the ambulances, yeah, for organophosphate poisoning is the duodote injector, the pen, and that has as its constituent parts, again this may be slight oversimplification, but it's one element of atropine and one element of pralidoxime, so those two differently acting drugs injected together.
That's correct, yes.
And so trying to treat the problem in different ways.
Yes.
But as far as the pralidoxime chloride is concerned, that's the theory. But is it right that certainly with Novichok's, that there is a problem with pralidoxime?
So there is challenges with pralidoxime, and that's not only limited to Novichok's. There are some other nerve agents as well, where pralidoxime is less effective. And
that takes us back, does it not, to the discussion we were having before lunch about the irreversible inhibition of the enzyme?
Yes, so correct. So left untreated, almost all organophosphates will lead to irreversible inhibition. With a number of organophosphates and nerve agents, you have the opportunity to restart that engine. But for some nerve agents, for example, Soman, there is a process called aging where you can't restart the engine because it's chemically modified, and however much oxime you were to introduce to try and reverse, that won't work. It won't work.
Let's look at a paragraph of your statement, FT49, where you explain, I think, this idea. So your statement, please, 005997, page 8. And if we can go to the bottom 3 lines of the page, can you see that? FT49 is paragraph 30. You say,
yes.
To understand how pralidoxime works, it's important to appreciate that the strong binding of nerve agents to acetylcholinesterase prevents it from breaking down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is required for normal nerve functions. So that once well, are you saying there that once it's had that effect, then this reactivating mechanism of the pralidoxime it doesn't work?
That's correct, yeah.
And then if we could go over the page, please. When reading on, when nerve agents, e.g. sarin and VX, cause this inhibition, they chemically modify what's that next one?
Phosphonylate.
Phosphonylate, the enzyme's active site. In this state, the enzyme remains relatively reactivatable, i.e. it can regain normal function when reversed by therapies such as pralidoxime. But then reading on to paragraph 31, you say that, however, for some nerve agents, like Soman, following the phosphorylation stage, the enzyme may become dealkylated, which means it's relatively unresponsive to pralidoxime therapies. And then let's move to paragraph 32. You say the Novichok agents are slightly different again, more challenging, and are highly potent at the enzymatic level, physically obstructing oxime access, so leading to rapid, within minutes, early and truly irreversible inhibition of the acetylcholine esterase that is almost completely unreactivatable by pralidoxime, even when given at high concentrations. So without getting too lost in the detail, FD49, would it be fair to say you're describing a range, perhaps, or I appreciate there are slightly different mechanisms at play, but are you saying that within this class of nerve agents, some of them are more likely to allow pralidoxime to reactivate the enzyme than others?
Yeah, completely. And so Novichok is ultimately right of arc and is super difficult with existing therapies to treat.
Even when given
early and even when given at high concentration. We may go on to talk about benefits, though,
yes,
of that elsewhere.
I will. But if we just imagine, if we take ourselves back to the duodope pen, and that slide where you had those two different groups of drugs, of medications.
Yes.
The cholinergic medications you've described as being of value in Novichok patients, but the pralidoxime, the oximes, for the reasons you explained here, other than their side benefits, which we'll come to, they don't do the job they're designed to do.
So at the point of injury with Novichok's, pralidoxime, to be colloquial, isn't bringing much to the party.
Yeah. Let's go on. There are two more points I wanted to ask you about. One of them is one you hinted at, because later on in your statement, it's at the bottom of this page, paragraph 34, you say that although the pralidoxime isn't doing that job of reactivating the acetylcholine esterase, that there were some benefits to giving it in Novichok patients. Can you describe those?
Yes. So from my involvement on the clinical advisory group, working with the clinicians closely, the risk-benefit analysis that we took felt, well, actually, pralidoxime may bring some benefit, so we should use this on the pathway, and we that's using standard treatment pathways, really. And there were a number of clinical observations that Dr. Haslam and the team noted. For example, some changes on the ECG, that's the electrocardiogram looking at the heart. One particular feature was described as T-wave inversion, which is a particular blip on an electrocardiogram that can be associated with cardiac stress. When Dr. Haslam started the pralidoxime treatment, we were able to see that resolve, and also the pralidoxime's infusions that were administered early, both for Sergei and Yulia, we found that it helped to reverse the oliguria that you heard about yesterday, and some of their blood gases improved rapidly. So we ultimately think that they were pralidoxime effects that were at different sites, and at different sites in the body and receptors. And it's not unusual for drugs to have what are termed off-target effects. And we believe that pralidoxime was having some beneficial effects, probably at muscarinic receptors and some other receptors in the body.
Right. So nothing to do with reactivating the enzyme,
No.
but as it happens, you gave them the drug and it had these other beneficial effects.
Beneficial effects, correct.
Just out of interest, was that something that was known before 2018, or was it something that you understood either for the first time or better with these cases?
So we were aware that there were off-target effects of oxime drugs, and there was, I suppose, non-clinical evidence that thought they may prove to be useful. Yeah.
The second point, and the last point I wanted to ask about these drugs, it is related to the language you use at paragraph 32. So maybe we could just scroll down a little bit more. It's very extreme, the language you use about Novichok causing truly irreversible inhibition of acetylcholinesterase and unreactivatable and so on. And given what we have heard from you earlier about the mechanism of the poisoning and the build-up of acetylcholine and that toxidrome of symptoms and so on, one might ask, well, if the enzyme can't be reactivated, how do people survive at all?
And that was my initial reaction on establishing that these individuals had been exposed to Novichok. I would have expected a very poor outcome and early death. But I think this is tantamount to the systematic approach of the medical response that we were able to treat effectively 4 out of 5 casualties.
Well, and if we can go, please, in your witness statement to page 6, paragraph 21. I wonder whether this is part of the answer. Thank you. You say there, FT49, while the Novichoks are described as highly potent, irreversible inhibitors of the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, natural body enzymes are known to regenerate over time, and therefore recovery can occur if the source of the inhibition, the Novichok, is removed. And then you give some details about the different speeds with which this happens in different parts of the body. But is that, in layman's terms, is that the process that was being allowed to happen within these patients, that the enzymes were regenerating themselves?
Yes, so I think so. If you can treat somebody, treat a casualty, and keep them alive for that in that interim and early phase, then with time, and it can be weeks, many weeks, there's a good chance that enzyme can regenerate itself.
And in its regenerated form, it won't be inhibited unless, of course, there's still poison.
Yes, so that's the challenge, and that's why decontamination is important, because you need to be sure there's no residual nerve agent left around to re-inhibit that new enzyme that's been made.
Yeah, but with that caveat, it can happen, and
it did.
Is that basically what did happen in those who survived?
That's correct, yes.
Just one other related point. We've been talking about people who were very seriously poisoned with Novichok, and you've told us about their care. If we just imagine people who may have been involved in the periphery of the events in 2018, first aiders, for example, or people who may have thought that they received a very passing trace of Novichok. Does it follow from what we've been saying that now, many years later, they can be confident that there will be no further any ill health effects from whatever may or may not have happened 6 years ago?
Yes, that's likely to be the case. Trace exposures, the human body is quite good at buffering a very low dose of exposure. It will bind to a few enzyme molecules, and then eventually your liver and kidneys will clear that enzyme and take away the protein and the nerve agents. So if people were asymptomatic, had no symptoms at the point of an inadvertent low dose contact, it would have no consequence. I would caveat that by saying that if people were symptomatic, then there was a mechanism in place to make sure that those casualties were followed up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me turn now to a different issue, although as with these other things it's related, and that is factors associated with survivability. I'm now back to talking about people who have had extreme Novichok poisoning. And what I will do is simply read, initially I'll just take you through 5 factors and see if you agree that they are associated with survivability, and then I'll ask you a few more questions about each of them, and of course ultimately I'll ask you some questions about how these different factors played out with different individuals who we've heard evidence about. So would you agree initially then that these 5 factors, which are taken from your witness statement, are associated with survivability in these cases? First of all, the size of the dose.
Yes, I mean, fundamentally, that's the key.
Secondly, the route of exposure.
Yes, again, very important.
Thirdly, the duration of exposure.
Yes, time to decontamination.
Fourth, factors that are specific to the victim that would affect speed of metabolism. We'll come back to what they are.
Yes.
And lastly, of course, we've just been discussing it, treatment.
Correct.
So as far as the size of the dose is concerned, I think you said that was critical. Is it possible to break that down into, first of all, simply sheer volume? I mean, we've heard the evidence, for example, about Charlie Rowley splashing it all over his hands, and we know Dawn Sturgess received a sizable dose. So volume on the one hand, but also the purity of whatever it is that they are being poisoned with. I mean, do those two both have their part to play, or not?
So purity will have a part to play, in that you would have a clean clinical picture of toxidrome. But fundamentally, the actual dose, the amount and concentration within the bottle in this case, or the concentration on the door handle, and the degree of contact and exposure to that material is directly correlated to your clinical signs and symptoms.
Yeah. I suppose it comes back to the point we were just making about people who receive trace amounts. Your explanation there was that the body is capable of dealing itself with a very, very small amount of something like Novichok, but the more it is, the harder it is to deal with.
Correct.
So that's the size of the dose. Route of exposure. I think in your witness statement you identify 3 routes. One is the percutaneous, that's liquid on skin route. Another is inhalation, and the third is ingestion.
Correct.
Now, on the facts of the cases we've been looking at, that third one, ingestion, from what we know now anyway, doesn't really seem to have played a part. No one, as far as we know, ate any Novichok.
Yes, it's unlikely. However, it's worth reflecting that was an original postulation at ZZ's that there had been an ingestion event.
Yes.
But we had very little evidence that there was an ingestion.
But then focusing on the other two, the percutaneous exposure, and perhaps we can turn to your witness statement at page 3, please. So it's 005997, page 3, and it's paragraph 10. So, just looking at that paragraph, FT49, you refer to Sergei and Yulia Skripal and Nick Bailey and Charlie Rowley, apparently all exposed to Novichok via the percutaneous route, predominantly through skin contact with an object or touching an environmental surface. So with the Skripals, the door handle,
Yep.
Nick Bailey, I think it was the body-worn camera, and Charlie Rowley putting it on his hands. And you say there's also some evidence to suggest that Mr. Rowley may have inhaled a small amount of Novichok. But you then go on to say percutaneous nerve agent effects, depending on the type of agent and the dose, are often delayed since these highly lipid soluble compounds need time to pass through skin into subcutaneous tissues before entering systemic circulation en route to the muscles, respiratory organs. We talked about the diaphragm earlier, the heart, and so on. So perhaps you can expand on that. Is that an important feature of the percutaneous exposure?
Yeah, so I think so. Firstly, lots of drugs are administered now with patches through percutaneous drug administration, and the route that those drugs get into the body is well characterised, but is slower often than drug administration through other routes. With nerve agents in particular, through this contact hazard, is, as I've stated there, they are highly lipid soluble, which means they like to cross lipid surfaces, and one of the lipid surfaces that we've got is skin. However, it will take a while, depending on the dose, to pass through that skin. So a very high dose, widespread exposure of skin would be much more rapid onset of signs and symptoms than a focused point of contact, because the exposure dose would therefore be smaller.
Yes,
Yeah.
I see. I think. Is there also a factor here about about different thicknesses of skin in different parts of the body?
So that's likely to be a factor. There's limited evidence on that, but hand surfaces generally have much thicker or more robust skin than, for example, neck, forearm, where there's not a great deal of percutaneous fat, so there's not much fat under the skin. Yeah. In those locations.
Well, you'll remember right at the beginning of the evidence, you deleted from your statement the suggestion that Dawn Sturgess had applied the Novichok to her neck.
Yeah,
correctly. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. However, we certainly have evidence that, unsurprisingly, since she thought it was perfume, she applied it to both of her wrists. And is there a point there about the, if you like, the vulnerability of the wrist skin in comparison, say, to skin on your hands?
That's likely, but I would say there'd be very limited evidence. Yeah, it's a logical assertion to make. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So that in any way, that's the percutaneous exposure, and is it right that it is to be contrasted in many of the respects we've been discussing with inhalation?
Yeah, very, very much so.
Perhaps you can explain.
Yes, so with an inhalational exposure, the moisture within our airway and the ready access to blood supply within the mouth and lungs mean that the route of absorption would be much quicker. And that's very important because the pattern of signs and symptoms that you then see in the casualties is likely to reflect the route of exposure.
Let's just go back to paragraph 10 of your witness statement, if we can. It's 05997, page 3. I think this is very much the point you're making in the second part of that paragraph. So the bottom half of paragraph 10, please. Do you see the line starting following an aerosol exposure? That, in essence, that's an exposure,
Inhaled,
an
yeah.
inhalation exposure. The delay in tissue distribution, that's the delay you've been describing in the percutaneous exposure,
Yes.
is circumvented, so the nerve agent more rapidly enters the systemic circulation via the lungs, swiftly causing rapid onset of symptoms and signs. Also, the anatomical proximity of vital organs to the lungs, particularly diaphragm, where there is a high density of cholinergic fibres, means that its paralysis would ensue rapidly. And this comes back to a point we were making earlier. Paralysis of the diaphragm would lead to respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. So the inhalation route leads to much more rapid, and is this fair, more serious symptoms?
Yes, I would agree. Rapid and significantly more serious set of signs and symptoms that will emerge rapidly. Yeah.
Let's move to the third factor, please, which was duration of exposure. We think immediately of the evidence about Charlie washing it off. At a very basic level, perhaps we can all, given the mechanism you've described, it's perhaps quite easy to understand that for as long as the poison is, let's say, on the skin, it's going to carry on transferring itself down into your body and repeating the same effect. So if it's removed, if it really is removed, then that will stop that effect, and that's going to have a beneficial effect. Is that basically what we're describing?
Yeah, so I think there's two factors to consider. One is gross contamination, which in my mind would be the presence of a liquid on a material or on skin, i.e., there's an oily liquid present on my hand.
Yeah.
Therefore, I'm going to wash it off, versus the presence of nerve agent on the hand, which is not visible.
Yeah. But so tell us. I mean, if you remove the gross contamination, if you wash it off,
Yeah.
does that have some beneficial effect?
Yes, a large beneficial effect. In fact, by reducing that duration of exposure time and duration that contamination can be absorbed into your body. So the sooner you wash your hands, the better.
And even if you don't get rid of all of it by washing your hands, what you do get rid of is equal to the benefit.
Yes, correct.
The fourth factor was factors specific to the victim. And I added, because I think I found it somewhere in your witness statement, that the factors need to be relevant to the speed of metabolism. So I suppose if someone's right-handed or short-sighted, that's not going to make any difference at all to their Novichok.
No,
The speed of
yeah, that's correct. I think individually we're all different, and the clinical signs and symptoms that we present with will all slightly subtly vary between us, and that's because of the genetic differences that we all have. I think what I'm more aiming at here as individual differences are particularly weight. Is a important factor here. So dose and the weight of the victim become important, because for dose equivalence, i.e. the same dose given to somebody who is half your weight that is more significant for a person who's half the weight of the next.
Is it double the danger, or does it work quite as easily as that?
There is a degree of dose dependency, but it's not a pure correlation.
So body weight is an important factor.
Indeed, yeah.
Comorbidities?
Yes,
So if someone is already ill?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so if you have had a comorbidity, for example, sustained a cardiac arrest, or had other toxic substances on board, collectively those are worsening your outcome chances.
And medication, if someone's on medication, might that have an effect on the speed with which Novichok is metabolized and therefore survivability?
Yeah, there is some theoretical impacts of medications, but actually in the cases that we're discussing in the inquiry, I can't think that are any pharmaceutical or drug treatments that would have impacted their outcomes.
No. So that was the fourth of those 5 factors. The last factor was treatment, which we've already discussed. Of course, we've heard what you have to say about the different efficacies of different treatments. Some of them depend on how quickly they are administered. One thing, of course, we do know is that both Charlie and Sergei Skripal received atropine. Sergei, I think, it just as atropine, Charlie within a duodote pen. It follows, I think, from what you said, that certainly would have had a beneficial effect. Would it have been a transient effect in the sense that it sort of pushed back against those symptoms for a while, and then wore off, or would it have actually had a sort of a long-term impact on their chances of survival?
So early intervention would have been of benefit, but it's worthwhile taking the 2 cases separately.
Yeah.
So for Charlie, early intervention with atropine and pralidoxine in the form of duodote and the dose of atropine that's in duodote would have provided some significant reversal of effects for a period of time in the order of 40 minutes to an hour, perhaps. Whereas the inadvertent administration of atropine, yes, that was a excellent drug dosing error to make, and that was, again, clinically beneficial in maintaining Sergei's heart rate. However, what that does do is make your clinical diagnosis at presentation, when you think about toxidromes, incredibly difficult, because one of the main stems of your toxidrome identification is what's the heart rate doing. And not knowing that atropine was on board, so the impact for Sergei was possibly slightly a slightly more challenging clinical diagnosis.
Yes. So those were the 5 factors. What I'd like to do now is just ask you a few more directed questions about the different cases with those factors in mind. And the first of the sort of differential issues, which we have touched on, but I'd like to address squarely now, is the difference in terms of the course and rapidity of the symptoms in Dawn's and Charlie's cases. We know from the evidence that they were both contaminated with a relatively significant amount of Novichok almost at the same time, and yet, as we've heard, the course of their symptoms, their conditions was remarkably different. Yeah. How do you explain that?
So I think I referred to this in my statement, but in essence, I think that the explanation is through exposure route. That the act of applying liquid to your wrist, a vapor will be generated, and if you smell your wrist, you are going to get an inhalational dose. That inhalational dose, with the existence of a skin exposure as well, combine for those to that rapid onset of signs and symptoms. And the unfortunate sequence of events with bradycardia and respiratory arrest and cardiac arrest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we can come back to. But so in terms of Dawn, it's the size of the dose, yes, but the fact that your assessment that she may well have inhaled it as well. And I think there was some reference from Charlie's interviews to Dawn commenting that it didn't seem to have much of a smell, which perhaps suggests that she tried to smell it.
Yeah. The multi-route exposure, I think, is...
Multi-route exposure.
If you think it's a perfume, you are quite likely to do that, aren't you?
And then in terms of distinguishing her case from Charlie's, as I've already mentioned, Charlie washed the Novichok that he had got on his hands off quickly, and I think you've already said that would make a considerable difference in terms of reducing the symptoms.
Yes, if I remember correctly, from one of Charlie Rowley's statements, he recalls not an oily substance, and very rapidly went to wash it off.
Yes, with soap and water.
With soap and water. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that rapid removal of gross contamination is already likely to provide a delayed onset of signs and symptoms.
I don't have the facts and figures for you, but was there an issue in their comparative weights as well?
If I remember correctly, Dawn was lighter, but I can't remember the figures off the top of my head either. I was aware at the time.
We can probably establish that, but let's just put it at the hypothetical level. If Dawn was considerably lighter than Charlie, and does it follow from what you've said earlier that would be another explanation for her suffering much more rapid and more serious symptoms?
Yes, correct, yeah.
Before we leave Dawn and Charlie, let me ask you about something that Charlie said in his recent witness tape for the inquiry, which I think I can describe as his own explanation for why he suffered symptoms so much later than Dawn did. And for these purposes, can we go, please, to Charlie Rowley's recent statement, which is INQ 005982, page 2, and paragraph 9. So we can see there, FT49, Charlie Rowley, and this is a statement from a few weeks ago, saying, "I've been thinking about why my symptoms took much longer to come on than Dawn's did. As I've said previously, I washed the Novichok off my hands very quickly using soap and water. Dawn did not do so. I went back into 9 Muggleton Road later on the 30th of June 2018, and we've heard the evidence, but some hours later, and could have recontaminated myself then. I smoked a half-used cigarette, and it could be that Dawn was holding that when she sprayed the Novichok on her. I used the tap that I'd used earlier, just after I got Novichok on my hands. I may have touched one of the places where the Novichok had been left when I spilled it, or when Dawn sprayed it, or otherwise." So, FT49, Charlie Rowley's suggestion now, I think, is that he got Novichok on his hands at the same time, more or less, as Dawn, but he washed it off, and, as it were, that was the end of that contamination. Several hours later, he came back to the house, and he is speculating that he may have recontaminated himself by a cigarette or by a tap or by touching something that had been involved in the earlier episode. And as we know, it was shortly after that that he himself collapsed and was taken to hospital. Your thoughts?
So it would be my assertion, given the time delay in the onset of signs and symptoms, him becoming unwell, that it was the initial exposure, which had just had time to ferment, for want of a better word, that led to him becoming unwell. If you draw a parallel with Sergei and Yulia, at the delay of 6 or so hours from the point of door handle to becoming clinically unwell, the delay was similar for Charlie from the point of exposure, known exposure, to onset of signs and symptoms. It's possible that he recontaminated himself by a percutaneous route by touching the tap and other items in the house, but the damage was done 6 hours hence.
Another way of putting it is one doesn't need to posit the recontamination to explain what happened to him. The initial contamination, on his hands, the washing it off, and then the delay is not something that you struggle to explain.
No, that would be my belief, that it was the initial exposure.
There is another issue relating to Dawn's case that I wanted to ask you about. We know, and you've mentioned it already, about the sequence of her symptoms and the fact that the initial sort of toxidrome effects really very quickly led to her cardiac arrest, and as we will hear next week, that in turn led to a hypoxic brain injury. That mechanism, the hypoxia, the lack of oxygen in the brain, how that can lead to a brain injury, is something that we will hear more of next week, as I say, from Professor Rutty and also from Dr. Saw and Professor Nolan. And so I don't need to ask you about those basic mechanisms. But is it right that the existence of the Novichok poisoning itself may have had some impact on the likelihood or the extremity of the brain injury?
So it's likely that the active respiratory arrest and cardiac arrest is the primary, i.e. lack of oxygen to the brain,
yes,
is the primary cause for that hypoxic brain injury. It's also possible that, well, it's likely that nerve agent contributed to damage to the lining of the brain, because, as I've mentioned in my statement earlier, it's highly lipid soluble. It likes to go into lipid tissues, and one of the densest lipid tissues in humans is the brain. So that passage of nerve agent to the brain, as well as generating seizure activity, will have damaged the integrity of the vessel walls and within the brain.
And so if that's right, and if the nerve agent had done that damage to the brain, would that, tell me yes or no, right or wrong, but might that have made the brain even less tolerant than it would otherwise have been of the starvation of oxygen, and or more likely to bleed in that sense?
Yeah, it's likely that the two things compounded one another, yeah.
Right. Thank you. Well, that's something we can take up with the experts next week. I have just one or two more of these areas of questioning about the facts that we've been exploring and those factors of survivability that we have touched on. And firstly, I need to go, if I may, to the Russian embassy document we looked at once or twice already. So that's INQ 004576, please, and it's internal page 22. Are you generally familiar with this document, FT49?
Yes, I'm aware of the document, yeah.
And so you'll be aware that it is a document that has been published, in fact updated several times by the Russian embassy, posing questions about what happened in 2018. And I want to ask you about the last two paragraphs on the page that we're looking at. So the first one raises a question which we have touched on, and it's similar to the discussion we've just been having about Dawn and Charlie, although it comes at it from a slightly different angle. It says, it has never been explained how it was possible for the Scripples to lose consciousness simultaneously several hours after coming into contact with the nerve agent, despite them being persons of different age, gender and body constitution. So that, as it were, brings back one of those factors that we've been discussing about weight and age and so on, and how quickly something is likely to metabolise, and poses the question, well, if that's right, if it does make a big difference, that makes it surprising that, as we've heard, the two of them must have been poisoned, if they were indeed poisoned at the door handle, within a few minutes of each other, and then several hours later they collapsed at more or less the same time. How do we explain that?
So this is likely related to dose, so which I've hopefully emphasised is the primary factor here. That it's my understanding that Sergei was the first to touch the door handle and likely remove the largest amount of gross contamination. So therefore, despite his larger weight than Yulia, I think he was almost double Yulia's weight, he had a considerably higher exposure dose, and Yulia's contact with the door handle, most of that gross contamination had been removed. So the actual onset of signs and symptoms. So once you've got that nerve agent on board, the onset of signs and symptoms are likely to accumulate over the same time period. So you've got to bear in mind the physical exposure dose, that almost fixed constant with a fixed route of exposure, i.e. percutaneous, that then led to similar times for onset of signs and symptoms. What I would also add is, because of Yulia's lower weight, her progression through the toxidrome was much more rapid when she became unwell than that of Sergei. So my assertion that they are not presenting in the same way, and I think we've heard from other clinical colleagues that they did not present in the same way at the same time.
So just taking a step back, the question posed in this document is why it's focusing on one moment, if you like, the moment that they collapsed, to use a general term, on the bench in the Maltings, which I think we can agree happened at more or less the same time.
Correct.
But as I understand it, your explanation for that is that the difference in their weight and so on was, as it were, cancelled out by Sergei having a larger dose.
Correct.
Have I summarised that correctly?
Yes, you have indeed.
But then you've made this further point that Yulia's smaller constitution means that she was actually moving through the toxidrome more quickly, which brings us to their presentation at the hospital. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Because you're right. I mean, this was something that both Dr. Haslam and Dr. Cockcroft mentioned. Dr. Cockcroft this morning talked to them about them being ill the wrong way round. You know, he would have expected the older man to be more sick, but in fact it was the other way around.
Yes, and that's a function of dose, and I think elsewhere in the course of giving evidence that can be shared.
Is it also possible that the atropine dose that Sergei had received accidentally could contribute to that, to them being the wrong way round at that point?
That would have been a contributing factor as well, yes.
So by the time you get to the hospital,
Yes, indeed.
the atropine might have made a difference to Sergei.
Yes, it would have made a difference to Sergei, yeah.
Yeah. The premise of the document that we're looking at is that they both lost consciousness together. Unless I've mistaken, Mr. O'Connor, that's not the evidence, is it? They both collapsed, or rather were both affected, one sitting rigid and in a funny position, and the other clearly unconscious.
Yes, and that's why I slightly avoided that language, because we've heard some more detailed evidence now.
Of course.
But I think it is. I mean, I don't think that provides a complete answer, because
I'm
they
right
did.
in my recollection, am I?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It may be that we can take a break in a moment, but FT49, let's look before then at the last of these bullet points. It's a similar but different point. It has never been explained why not a single person providing first aid and further medical assistance to the Scripples ever developed any signs or symptoms of nerve agent poisoning, even if the nature of the poisoning was not known for at least 2 days. One can actually expand that. It's not just the first aiders to the Scripples, it's the first aiders to the Dawn and Charlie as well. We've heard from a number of them now. We've heard, first of all, that many of them, not all of them, certainly not those who treated Charlie Rowley, were working on the assumption that it was an opiate case, not a nerve agent case. And although we've certainly heard that PPE was worn, I think the thrust of the point here is that certainly those greater precautions that would be taken in a nerve agent case weren't taken. We've certainly heard about secretions, vomit, lots of circumstances which might have posed a risk of contamination, and yet essentially no evidence of anyone certainly suffering serious symptoms as a result of them being involved in these cases. Do you have an answer to this point?
I can give you some relatively strong theories that with liquid nerve agent, the clue's in the name. It's liquid. So if that is on a surface, that becomes a clear contamination hazard. You know, a drop of liquid on a table is likely to be contaminated. It's likely to be spread. Sorry. And could become a source of exposure, and that hard surface source of exposure, to the best of my knowledge, is where all of the casualties emerged from in this case. Handling a victim as a bystander when there is no gross contamination, i.e. liquid, maintained on that individual, the vast majority of that nerve agent has been absorbed by that individual, so therefore poses much less of a risk to other bystanders. And also there is a dilution factor. The more times I touch the table, a non-contaminated table with my finger, like fingerprints, you dilute your fingerprint as you move across. The concentration of nerve agent on your hand would drop as you move your finger from point to point to point. So therefore, the risk of person-to-person spread is much lower than a contact hazard.
So, in summary, FT49, with all the expertise we've heard about and your understanding of these cases, you accept broadly, factually, what's put here, but it's not something that surprises you or you find hard to understand.
No.
So I do have more questions on a couple of other topics, but they are rather separate. We've been going for an hour and a quarter. I suggest we have a break at this point.
Yes, certainly. 3:05, please. You've some questions, I expect, Mr. Mansfield?
Yes.
And Mr. Straw as well?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Well, we shall need to finish at the appropriate time, but I know you've got that in mind. All right.
All rise.
What would you like? Well, I've got both. Did you get your colour on if you like? No. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be restarting very shortly if I can encourage you to take your seats. Thank you.
All rise.
Yes.
FT 49, we established right at the start of your evidence that in the period following the Skripal poisoning, you were performing at least two different roles. One of those roles was as a chemical and biological expert advisor to the police investigations, and then there was also the role as part of the clinical advisory group that we discussed earlier. Was it part of your function in either of those capacities to be thinking about the possibility of a possible further round of exposure to nerve agent and what the response to that sort of incident would look like?
In short, no. My bandwidth was pretty much taken up with looking after and advising the clinical team on casualty management. There would have been specific questions that would have had clinical impact at the operational level that then would have become specific questions for me to say what did I think of the impact of X, Y, and Z was. And then I would have addressed that through my chain of command within DSTL, so through an operations room that was set up, and then that is how we would have fed into, for example, scientific advisory group or into SAGE or elsewhere.
Let me just press you a little bit, and I'd like to ask you about a particular document and see what your reaction to it is. So if we could have on screen, please, INQ 004704. FT49, this is a document we've looked at as an inquiry before, and I think you had a chance to look at this at least last night. Is that right?
That's correct. That was the first time I've seen that last night.
You haven't seen it? No. It's dated the 15th of March 2018, so a week and a half or so after the Skripal poisoning. It's an email sent, I think, within the Department of Health and Social Care. And if we can it attaches a document, which is really what we need to see. If we can turn over to page 3, please. We can see that the document is a reasonable worst-case scenario for a secondary incident. Do you see that?
Yes, I can.
And in those numbered points at the top of that page, 1, 2, and 3, the different possible scenarios are listed. The first being a second targeted attack on specific individuals, in other words, another sort of Skripal type event, and the other two are accidental discoveries of discarded agent, the first by humans and the second by animals. Do you see?
Yes, I can see that.
And then, if we go towards the bottom of the page, we see against the number 2, there are some considerations listed relating to the second two of those considerations, the scenarios rather, the accidental discovery scenarios. And this is the hypothesis, the scenario. We see up to 6 members of the public exposed, 4 emergency services personnel exposed, 1 fatality, 9 other casualties, and so on. So that it's a guess, it's a best guess, it's a scenario against which to plan. Yes?
Yes.
Are you familiar with this type of document, even though you didn't see this at the time?
Yes, I am familiar with reasonable worst-case scenario
Yes.
documents.
And so if we then go over the page again, we can see a grid which extrapolates from that scenario and uses the scenario as a basis against which to plan. And so the first section of the grid at the top, we see on the left, that relates to issues relating to the first response, training, equipment, and so on. And then below that, if we can go to the next line, we see hospitals and health infrastructure. And if we can just scroll down to the next one as well and have that in mind too, we see medical countermeasures. Do you see that?
Yes, I can see.
So,
yes.
And we see that the medical countermeasures section asks about what countermeasures are available, how quickly could they be deployed, do we need extra stocks? And then if we could scroll back up to the hospitals, please, we see issues relating, for example, to hospital capacity, knowledge and training amongst hospital staff, availability of PPE, and so on. So we've established you didn't see this at the time.
That's correct.
But it does appear, and help us, that many of those issues that would have overlapped with your responsibilities, for example, on the clinical advisory group, the types of issues that you would have been faced with, and indeed were faced with, when the second incident, as we know, did in fact arise. And my question, in short, is whether you think it would have been helpful for either you or someone on the clinical advisory group or someone at DSTL to have been involved in considering these types of issues in the weeks following the Skripal poisoning.
I think yes, involvement would be useful in this type of document because there's elements of specialist knowledge within DSTL that could have supported the specific questions within such a document. Most of the healthcare related and public health risks would have been managed by which is PHE, now UKHSA, acting in concert with other government departments and agencies to help address each of these bullet points. The point at which that fusion would have happened, I'm not quite clear. It may well have been at SAGE or elsewhere, but yeah, such a document as this, and as is typical, requires a multi-agency input.
We know, I think you helped us with this earlier, but we know the clinical advisory group was set up again after Amesbury, and you were a member of it again.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that in terms of its scale, the second wave, if I can put it that way, was smaller than the first. There were fewer casualties that you had to deal with.
That's correct. I would just clarify. So the major objective in terms of reference for that clinical advisory group, and I believe there are terms of reference for that clinical advisory group that are documented by PHE at the time, were in support primarily of patient management and aiding the hospital to maintain their day-to-day function. The non-patient activities are clearly more led at the UKHSA level through a different process. There was no direct, it was informal, the process between CAG and the other established processes.
Yes, I think I understand that, and I certainly don't want to try and sort of lure you into answering questions outside the scope of what you were doing at the time.
Yeah.
But just going back to that time post-Amesbury, clinical advisory group set up again.
Yeah.
You found yourself again advising on the treatment of a different group of patients.
Yes.
In that capacity, accepting it's a relatively restricted capacity, were there times when you thought, I wish we'd thought of this 2 months ago, I wish we'd planned for this, I wish we'd, for example, thought about a lack of this medication, or it would have been better to have done that training, or if you want to use a sort of slightly pejorative term, were you aware of missed opportunities at that stage that you felt it would have been better to plan for between the two events?
I think that the individual patient identification of signs and symptoms is an incredibly challenging thing to do, both in the pre-hospital environment and also within in a hospital environment, unless you've got specialist knowledge. And education is always of benefit across the healthcare spectrum. As we've said, there were a number of events where knowledge was shared, and as Dr. Haslam said as well, where available, we were communicating the clinical management aspects and the clinical identification aspects as vehemently as we could. I think the more operational aspects of where medical countermeasures are held and pre-planning, that was in train between the first incident and the second, and I think had the second incident not occurred at that time, the establishment of clearer education and clearer guidance was in the process of being generated. For instance, I'll point you to a UK HSA document on major incident planning, which was published in July 18, which has a CBRN section in it that was not previously there. And I know that those documents, or I'm aware that those documents were being worked up, and then the Amesbury incident happened. So coincidentally, that may have slowed what was a linear process of producing new guidance and information.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned that issue of presentation.
Yep.
And this is something that we've asked a number of witnesses about, and I wanted to touch on it with you, if I may, please. And to do that, can we call up on screen, please, INQ 004750. If we go to the front page, please. Thank you. So FT49, this is a document you're familiar with.
Yes, I am.
It's the report of the learning event that took place at Porton Down, but the PHE bit of Porton Down. And I think it was the 19th of April.
That's correct, yes.
2018.
That's correct.
A meeting at which you were present.
That's correct.
And we know, it says somewhere in this document, this report was published on, I think it was the 9th of July, the day after Dawn Sturgess died. But is it fair to say that if we look at this report, it will at least help us to understand what was discussed several months earlier at the meeting in April?
Yes, it would.
Were you anything to do with when or how this report was published?
I was not invited as a speaker, but I was there as an observer and was able to contribute freely to the presenters and discussions, and therefore learning objectives that came out that are within that report.
Yes, yeah, and sorry, I didn't make myself very clear. So that was your role at the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to cover off, there is a potential issue about what might be termed a delay in publishing this report between the date of the meeting in April and July. Were you involved in that process of actually putting together this report and publishing it?
No, I wasn't part of the review process.
Right. So let's talk about the meeting using this document as a means to do that. And if we could go, please, to page 5 of the document, we see the executive summary. If we can look at the top paragraph, it refers to the meeting having happened, as we've said, on the 19th of April. The purpose being to enable clinicians to discuss the incident and their access to specialist clinical advice during the clinical response to the deliberate limited release of nerve agent and so on. There's then a list of attendees. There's actually another list, similar list, a couple of pages further on. Mm-hmm. We heard from Mr. Darch that he was there. I think certainly the ambulance service were represented. We can cast our eye down that list and see that a number of government agencies were represented, as well as we've heard from Dr. Haslam and others, the treating clinicians, and you say you were there.
Yes.
And then, sorry, if we can zoom out on that page and look at the bullet points below that paragraph, please. And in particular, we can look at the third bullet point. We can see that one of the conclusions which is highlighted in this executive summary is that the initial circumstances, and that's the initial circumstances of the presentation of the scribbles, yes?
That's correct.
The initial circumstances suggested that the patients might be suffering from a drug overdose. However, the clinical presentation was inconsistent. Clinical assessment remains key in determining the correct diagnosis to inform the appropriate patient care. And then, if we could turn to page 8, please. In passing, we can note towards the top of that page there's a list of participants. As I say, I haven't minutely studied it, but it looks very much like the same list as we saw in that paragraph of the executive summary. But then towards the bottom of the page, under the main heading Learning, under 4.1, we return to this point about clinical presentation. And there is some detail given about the facts of the Skripal case, the location. This is something we've heard from another witness, where they were found, had a reputation as an area for recreational drug use. That knowledge having combined with the initial report of 2 people fitting, suggesting to first responders that they were attending a potential drug overdose. We can carry on over the page, please. At 4.1.2, the ambulance participants describing a number of concurrent clinical symptoms that did not facilitate the making of an accurate assessment of the patients at the scene. While a drug overdose seemed possible, the patient's clinical presentation was not fully consistent with this, including their response to naloxone, which we've heard about. And then one can simply read down the following paragraphs there. That there is a record of the sorts of issues that we've heard about in evidence, ending at 4.1.6, as far as this report is concerned, with a conclusion relating to the importance of clinical assessment being emphasised, and alongside the importance of following up on everything that might seem inconsistent or not quite right. And a learning point along very much the same lines. Now, that's what the report said. What memory have you got of these matters being discussed at that meeting?
As you can imagine, it was quite a busy time. I don't recall much of that meeting. Being there, and my notebook, which I believe is an evidence item, I took a large number of notes from that meeting. I remember a significant discussion around the challenges of clinical diagnosis and that there was some agreement that, as is reflected in Learning Point 1, that clinical assessment and management should be raised more broadly.
Yes. Well, you mentioned your notes, FT49, and I'll be correct if I'm wrong, but I haven't found them particularly helpful on this particular issue. But one of the suggestions we've heard has been that there was, as it were, a limitation on what could be discussed at the meeting because of concerns about patient confidentiality. And so somehow the discussion about the case and the risks for the future and the overlapping symptoms of so on, there was a shortfall, if you like, and that people could have left that meeting without having got to grips with the detail of this issue. Can you help us at all about that or not?
I don't recall there being an issue around patient confidentiality, given the audience that was present at that meeting. I think that it was the first time I'd seen in a single location a fusion of the clinical pathway, i.e. pre-hospital, i.e. paramedics, and others presenting what they'd established from the casualties in the pre-hospital environment through then into the hospital. So it was hence why my notes in the book are quite copious and look like spider handwriting, because I was actually learning pre-hospital things that I was unaware of in real time.
This may be an even more difficult question to answer, but I suppose putting ourselves in your shoes, you had first been involved in the Skripal case a day or two after they arrived in hospital.
Yes.
Which was, as we've heard, very much around the time that the Novichok diagnosis was being made. You weren't around, for example, on the day they arrived when Dr. Cockcroft was grappling with the diagnosis and so on. Had you actually been aware at the time that you were involved in the clinical advisory group that there had been a sort of confusion in the first day or two about what the diagnosis was?
So I was aware on the Monday morning at approximately 10 o'clock. I received a phone call from Dr. Russell, who gave me a brief description of casualties that were in the hospital. And I remember saying to him, well, that sounds to me like that's nerve agent, isn't it? And I think that in the context of, I believe at that point, around about probably 10 o'clock in the morning, I think on that Monday, Sergei's identification had been established. So with that additional knowledge and the description that Dr. Russell gave me, that was my first awareness. I then made my way to DSTL.
Yes.
And was formally read into what was evolving.
I see. Well, that was my mistake. I hadn't appreciated you were involved quite that early. Did you? If you were involved at that point on the Monday morning, that would have been during the time Dr. Cockcroft was managing the case. Do you recall speaking to him? We know that Dr. Russell spoke to him.
No, at that point I did not, because the governance process were not in place for me to go direct to the NHS.
No. Well, in any event, we've seen that there was a discussion between Dr. Russell and Dr. Cockcroft,
Yes.
which Dr. Russell suggested nerve agent.
Yep.
So, for whatever, whether through your suggestion or otherwise, that was part of the story. Let me move, if I may, FT49 to the last of the issues I want to ask you about, which is in fact about the similar period in the second incident, so the diagnosis, the early days of the Amesbury incident.
Yeah.
And we know, of course, that Dawn and Charlie were poisoned on Saturday the 30th of June. And by then, of course, the Scripples have been discharged, and I take it that the clinical advisory group have been stood down.
Literally days prior to that date.
What we can see is that starting on the 30th of June, there were a series of text messages between you and Dr. Dukes, who was the intensivist who led the care in the early days, at least, of Dawn and Charlie.
That's correct.
And if we can look at those, please. First of all, it's INQ 005067. And so the first two messages were sent by Dr. Dukes to you in the evening of that Saturday night, the 30th of June. I'll read them. First of all, this is a message, the first one sent at 19:52 that evening. He said, "Hi, FT49." He didn't actually say hi, FT49, of course. He said, "I'm after a little favour or info. Essentially, who do I need to contact to do some acetylcholine esterase levels at Porton? I think the ED, presumably the emergency department team,
yes,
are going to try and contact someone too. Before the hospital goes panic-stricken, I was hoping to prove all is well. The story is too long to text, but involves 2 admissions of unconscious bradycardic people, so people with a slow heart rate.
correct.
1 has arrested, no sweating, poor history of diarrhoea, but yes, pupils are small. Probably drugs, but hazard suits have already been mentioned, ! Cheers, Stephen." And then there's another message, only about 10 minutes or so later. "So we found the point of care kit, and the ED guy can use it. It might stop everyone trying to decontaminate everything.
Yes, that's correct.
Also, CID have just told me they have evidence of drug use at the house. As we thought, drugs. Sorry to have bothered you. Trying to wildfire inappropriately taking off." He might have meant trying to perhaps stop a wildfire inappropriately taking off. And we can ask him about this when he comes to give evidence next week. So those were the first 2 messages. We'll have to chop and change a little between the messages and your statement. Let's go, if we can, to your statement, please. It's IMQ 005997, page 7. And if we go to the top of the page, thank you. You say, "I was made aware that a suspected drug intoxication had occurred in 2 individuals via a text message sent from Dr. Dukes to my personal mobile at 19:52 hours on the 30th of June, requesting a favour or info for acetylcholinesterase testing." That's the first of the messages we just looked at.
Yes.
This was followed up by a text message 20:05, that's the second message we just looked at, explaining that the commercially available cholinesterase testing machine, so it was described in the text message as the point of care kit.
Point of care, yes.
Yeah. Provided by DSTL during the previous incident, had been located in the hospital, and Dr. Dukes also informed you that the house, and that was associated with opiate use. Do you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
And then you give us some further detail in the next paragraph. You say you didn't read either of those text messages until later that evening, and don't recall the time. It appears you may have been watching an international football match at the time. But you go on to say that you followed up reading the messages with a phone call that night to Dr. Dukes. So we're still on the Saturday night.
That's
Where
correct.
he provided further clinical information. I recall Dr. Jukes explaining that one known regular hospital attendee, a recreational drug user, so pausing there, that would be Charlie Rowley,
That would be, yes.
and his partner, Dawn Sturgess, had been admitted to intensive care. One of the casualties, Dawn Sturgess, had sustained a cardiac arrest at scene, and with advanced life support measures, had a return of spontaneous circulation, was now intubated, ventilated, and had ongoing pinpoint pupils and a bradycardia. He explained that a second casualty from the same location had been brought into hospital some hours later, again with pinpoint pupils, also bradycardic. Both patients were being treated medically for this with supportive therapies, naloxone, with some need of atropine. And then you say this, at this point, in my opinion, the likely diagnosis was that of a potent opiate or mixture. We've just been talking about the training session in April, FT49, and of course we will all be aware of the dangers of hindsight, and us sitting in this room knowing what we know, and we need to be mindful of you sitting at home having just turned the football off. But all the same, there had been the first incident, there had been the training and thoughtfulness about the risk of misdiagnosing future cases. Can you expand on why it was at that time that you're, in your opinion, despite the fact that Dr. Dukes had contacted you and started talking about decontamination and using the cholinesterase machine and so on, you had a diagnosis in your mind of opiate or a mixture, as you put it?
Yes, so based on the information that I had at that time, the most likely diagnosis based on common things being common, you may have heard from other clinical colleagues using that phrase, was that of recreational drug overdose or contaminated recreational drug exposure. And to put that into context, in 2018, the ONS said there were 4,300 drug-related deaths, and that's deaths rather than casualties. With a history provided to me orally, so by phone, and also in the text message of potential recreational drug being in that environment where these casualties were, your mind is drawn more to common things being common, be that cognitive bias, but that's what it is. And you therefore need secondary markers with which to redirect you, and that may be being a spy or an ex-spy, or an alternative reason for that. So at this point, it was my best guess on the clinical information that I had that it was recreational or contaminated recreational.
I suppose another secondary indication of the type you mentioned might be that the ambulance crew who attended one of those incidents was convinced that it was a nerve agent poisoning and had actually administered a duodote pen. Did you know that at the time?
No, I did not.
If you had, would that have made a difference?
Yes.
I mean, Dr. Jukes wasn't just texting you saying we've got a couple of drug cases in. He was saying we've got a couple of cases with symptoms. Everyone's talking about decontamination. I want to dust off the acetylcholinesterase machine, but I don't want to run away with it unless it's really necessary. So, when you rang him, did you ask him, well, why? Why are people talking about the possibility of nerve agent or acetylcholinesterase?
So if I recall that call that telephone call correctly, it was primarily a description of clinical signs and symptoms and background information on the casualties that had been provided by the police to Dr. Dukes.
Right. So you didn't ask him for the sort of, if he could help you understand the reason?
So I didn't press him on additional nerve agent, more specific nerve agent signs and symptoms.
Okay. I asked you if it would have made a difference if you'd known about the ambulance crew and the duodope pen and so on. Tell us, expand on that. What would that have triggered in your mind?
That would have raised a red flag that in the pre-hospital environment, that somebody was worried at that point of exposure.
Yeah.
I think so. It's my recollection as well at this point that both casualties were intubated and ventilated. Yes, so we're now intubated and ventilated at the middle of paragraph 24. So the overt sets of signs and symptoms that could have helped with that different diagnosis from the pre-hospital environment would have triggered a different response from me.
All right. Let me read on in your statement, please, FT 49. So let's look at paragraph 25. So you said, really picking up where we'd left off, the information provided in the latter message and the subsequent call with Dr. Dukes helped me to conclude on the balance of probabilities that recreational drug use or exposure or overdose were the most likely cause of both casualties' symptoms and signs. And then for context, you had around this time, June 2018, there had been a number of recreational drug use deaths that had been linked to potential contaminated materials. I explained to Dr. Dukes the only definitive way to establish if there was an organophosphate, i.e. pesticide, in a contaminated batch of recreational drug was to send blood samples to the Birmingham toxicology labs. And if available, undertake a local blood test using the commercially available analyzer which DSTL provided to the hospital.
Yeah, the point of care test.
Point of care.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, just going back into that paragraph, FT 49. We've heard about opiate overdose, heroin or fentanyl. We've heard about nerve agents. This seems to be proposing a third possibility, albeit somewhere between the two, an opiate or an overdose or a dose of a drug, let's say an opiate, but a drug which had been cut with a pesticide.
Or another cholinesterase inhibiting compound.
So in other words, someone would have taken something which was both a drug, but it was something they were taking for its recreational benefits, if you like, but which, because of what it had been cut with, it would affect the cholinesterase.
Correct.
Now, where did this come from? Was this something that you thought it might be, or that Dr. Dukes suggested it might be? Was it something that had cropped up in Salisbury in recent weeks, or not?
So in the, I take you to a second level of toxicology, and it's published in the literature that a number of recreational drugs are cut with other drugs and materials to either improve the primary recreational drugs effect. A relatively common drug that is cut with that is called procaine. Procaine's a white powder and is a precursor for cocaine. That drug can inhibit acetylcholinesterase. So, we recall back to my early evidence around reversible cholinesterase inhibitors. Procaine being a reversible cholinesterase inhibitor. So when you looked at a point of care machine or even a acetylcholinesterase laboratory-based assay, you may see a degree of inhibition. And further on in my statement, I talk about degrees of cholinesterase inhibition.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
So, but just as a sort of factual possibility, a scenario.
Yes, indeed.
Do you think it's something then that you suggested to Dr. Dukes might be in play here, or can you not remember?
So yeah, in the context of a contaminated batch, that would have included other cut materials that...
Yeah, I think you're being asked, which of you raised it? Can you remember?
I definitely raised a contaminated batch with... because I also recall using the figure 3 somewhere.
Is it common or uncommon for opiate drugs to be, as you put it, cut, diluted with other materials?
Well, so it's recognised that a number of intravenous recreational drugs like heroin are cut with other things, like procaine, as I've mentioned, sir, and that's relatively common. Whether or not recreational drug use and cholinesterase inhibition on blood tests is not commonly known. Does that make sense?
I think it is. It does. Because at this stage, as I understand it, so we're still talking about the Saturday night here.
Correct.
Yes, Dr. Dukes is saying that they found I keep forgetting what you call it, the point of care, was it? Yeah, the point of care machine.
Yes.
They found it, and they found someone in the department who could use it.
Yes.
But they hadn't done any testing at that stage, had they?
No.
So they weren't, but were you speculating about, well, if we do use it on these patients and if it shows a suppressed acetylcholine level, does that necessarily, what might that be telling us? Was that the context in which this suggestion of...
No. So I was encouraging him to test
Yes.
with a point of care machine, and also encouraging that be a robust test, though. You'll note from one of Dr. Duke's text messages back to me that he couldn't find the person that had been trained to use it because they weren't in the hospital at that point. So therefore, the reliability of that test and that machine not being calibrated needed to be considered and perhaps taken with a pinch of salt, that it hadn't been used appropriately.
Let's just move on in the story just slightly and look at paragraph 26 of your statement, please. So you say on the 1st of July, so we're now on to the Sunday. Yeah?
Yes, correct, yes.
On the 1st of July, in the evening, a further text message was sent to my phone by Dr. Dukes, explaining that some local testing, so would this be testing at the hospital with the point of care machine, do you think?
Yes, it would be.
Had indicated, quotes, results consistent with cholinesterase inhibition, and samples sent to Birmingham asking about drugs contaminated by pesticide. Further discussions with Dr. Dukes established the patients were now being treated with pralidoxime, and I asked about the degree of blood cholinesterase inhibition. In a text message that I sent later that night, so later on the Sunday night, to Dr. Dukes, I highlighted that if this was, quotes, really significant inhibited potent organophosphates could be possible. My thinking at this time was that establishing which type of organophosphate could be responsible would require detailed analysis using the labs, and that if the Birmingham Poisons Laboratory did not identify the culprit chemical, a more obscure cause would need urgent investigation. Yes?
Yes, correct, yes.
And then if we may back at the text messages, please. So we're back to INQ 005067. And so we can pick this up at the bottom. So that there is a message from Steve Dukes on the Sunday evening, which I think the times match. It would be one of the ones we've just been discussing. So Steve Dukes says to you, only to keep you in the loop, we have history, you know. found the point of care kit on the unit, read the instructions and hoping for user error, as the results are consistent with cholinesterase inhibition. A formal sample has gone off to Birmingham because you Porton lot are no longer interested in civilian stuff. We'll pass over that. So running diagnosis, contaminated drugs with pesticide. Pralidoxime, here we go, unless they were randomly selected by the Russians to test us again. And if we go over the page, please, your response, it's, so the message we just read, 20 to 7 on the Sunday evening, your response just after midnight, later that night.
Yes, correct.
Thanks, Steve. Only just seen your message. If it was close to the normal range on the kit, but just below threshold, it will come up with consistent with cholinesterase inhibition. Think there were only 3 pesticide OD last year. If patients are really significantly inhibited, let me know and I'll sort something out in the morning. Tell me if this is a fair reading of these text messages and your explanation, the witness statement, FT49. It appears that both you and Dr. Jukes were really assuming that the cholinesterase inhibition that was being seen was likely to be caused by pesticide because of the unlikelihood of another deliberate targeting event, what Dr. Jukes said, unless these 2 were randomly selected by the Russians to test us again.
Yes.
But what about the possibility that these 2 had been the victims of a discarded container of Novichok? So in other words, if we think back to that reasonable worst-case scenario, the first, number 1 on the list was another targeted attack, but numbers 2 and 3 were the discarded container. That doesn't seem to appear anywhere in this analysis at all.
So I think this is around balance of probabilities and common things being common. A contaminated batch of recreational of a recreational drug is considerably more likely than another source of that consistent cholinesterase inhibition. I think it was clear at that point, for me, from a distance via text message, that Dr. Jukes had the casualties in front of him and was able to see clinical signs and symptoms, and they were being treated at the point of these text messages as though they were an organophosphate exposure. So maximal therapy was underway at that point. We just didn't have a biochemical diagnosis.
Yes. Appreciate all of that. And I hope I've said, and will say it again, that we are all aware of the risks of hindsight.
Yes.
And I will add that half of this conversation at least was Dr. Jukes, and we can ask him about this next week. But with all those things in mind, if we can just scroll back to the bottom of page 1, please. Common things are common, and that may be why Dr. Jukes is saying that he's running with a diagnosis of contaminated drugs with pesticide as an explanation for the reduced cholinesterase levels. But then he says, after mentioning pralidoxime, unless they were randomly selected by the Russians to test us again. So a common thing, the drugs, an extremely uncommon thing,
Yes.
Random targeting. But what he doesn't mention is another possibility, perhaps less uncommon than another targeted attack, is the possibility that these people had come across a discarded or left behind container of Novichok. That just doesn't seem to have entered into the thinking at all, and nor, when you responded, did you say, oh, well, those aren't the only 2 possibilities. What about possibility of discarded Novichok?
And it's likely that cognitive bias around a known recreational drug user with Charlie, and then Dawn's potential exposure. It was unclear at that point as to the provenance of Dawn's background to me. So therefore, if I'd had information at that point that there was a casualty who was not or linked to recreational drugs, that would have been an additional flag.
I don't want to labour this point.
And I think it's about aggregation of information that you need to form that clinical view.
As I say, for 249, I don't want to labour this point. I'm not asking these questions just so that we can all be wise after the event. But one of the things the chair will have to consider in due course is whether those who were involved at the centre of all this, including you and Dr. Dukes and others, gave enough thought to the possibility of there being other deposits of Novichok out there in the time between Salisbury and Amesbury. And so what I just ask you is whether, would it be fair to look at this exchange between you and Dr. Dukes and read into that you two at least might have been more thoughtful, perhaps because of training you hadn't received or reasonable worst case scenario documents that hadn't been circulated to you or whatever else, that you might have at that point have benefited from having had more discussion or training about the possibility of there being other deposits of Novichok out there which could lead to further cases.
Yes, it's likely that broader awareness of the operational situation at that point would have raised additional concerns that would have meant we were not leading on that cognitive bias towards recreational drug use. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Lastly, if we just go back to the statement, please. So it's INQ 005997, and it's page 8. Just to finish off the narrative. So paragraphs 27 through to 29, FT49. It's right, I think, that the Birmingham results, the tests which went off to Birmingham, which we saw being discussed in those text messages, came back on Monday the 2nd. Is that right?
That's my recollection, yes.
And that those tests confirmed, essentially, cholinesterase suppression, 1, and 2, no pesticide, but did not tell you what it was that was causing the suppression.
Correct.
And that blood samples were taken on that day, on Monday the 2nd. Were they analysed at Porton Down or at the CBRN centre, or is that the same thing?
The National CBRN Centre is the formal route of receipting samples into DSTL.
I see.
As soon as it was clear to me and that there was significant cholinesterase inhibition, then we activated. It was a more obscure form of agent that was a nerve agent that was at work here. So therefore, that's when we activated receipt of those samples.
Right. And the presence of Novichok was then confirmed the next day, on Tuesday the 3rd of July.
That's correct. And at DSTL as well, we'd been able to confirm cholinesterase inhibition consistent with complete cholinesterase inhibition.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, FT49. That's all the questions that I have for you.
Yes. Mansfield.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Mansfield. I represent the family of Dawn Sturgess. Just a few follow-up questions on the matters you've already been asked. But I'm going to restrict, because of time, the number of documents, probably just one, and it's your statement. If we could have a particular, you've got it in front of you, page 4 internally, but it's actually 005997 and then 404. It's the internal 4, and it's paragraph 14. Do you have that page?
Yes, I do.
If you kindly look at paragraph 14, if you go halfway down, you're talking about the rapid onset of severe symptoms, obviously in relation to Dawn Sturgess, and cardiorespiratory arrest. Now, look at the next sentence. In the absence of a diagnosis of nerve agent poisoning at the scene and access and so on, would it be fair to say that when you wrote this statement, which is September this year, even then you didn't know that a paramedic team attending that day thought that there was this was a case of nerve agent that they come across before, not Dawn, but the other one, Charlie Rowley?
I was aware that that they had a differential diagnosis from the learning event that was held at Public Health England.
Do you mean the one on the 19th?
Correct.
So you knew on the 19th that there was a group, in other words, paramedics who had a differential diagnosis.
Well, I believe I've got my timelines wrong there, haven't I?
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
which 19th are you asking about, Mr. Mansfield?
April. I thought that's what he was talking about.
Well, that's...
Yeah, no, so that
That's
predates.
before
Yes, so,
Yes, quite.
so, apologies.
So shall we start again?
Yes, please do.
All right. This is your statement in September this year.
Yes.
When you wrote the statement, were you aware that at the scene in relation to Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley, same scene but different times of day, that there had been a diagnosis of a nerve agent in relation certainly to Charlie Rowley? Did you know that when you wrote the statement?
I was unaware of the paramedic concern.
Right. Well, this was purely an interpretation of your statement that I'd made, namely you didn't know in September that that was the case. Would you agree there's a severe communication problem between the various agencies involved in this matter?
No, I
I think
wouldn't.
that's probably for me, Mr.
Yeah,
Mansfield.
very well. I'll
But you can certainly say what you knew, and it would be helpful if you did.
Yes, I can shed some light on that. I believe that there's good communication between UKHSA, DSDL, Department of Health. I think at the operational level of individual cases, lessons learnt, and learning for the wider medical community could be improved.
Yes, all right. And the reason I'm concentrating on that, if I may, with you, is that you've said only moments ago this afternoon that had you known at the time, as opposed to now, that a paramedic group who attended Charlie Rowley in particular were of a mind, namely that it was nerve agent, they'd been there before, one of them had, in Salisbury. You said that it would have produced from you a different response. Do you remember saying that today?
I do remember saying that.
Right. And now what I want to ask you is, what is the different response that you would have had you been told that bit of information?
I would have. I wasn't on call when I received those messages from Dr. Jukes, but I would have immediately escalated that information into DSDL for and then into.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last word.
So into DSDL and then into the CBRN centre.
Yes.
The police CBRN centre.
And what would be the object of doing that?
In that would trigger a public health response.
Yeah.
It would also trigger the ICOSA, which is a part of a JESIP operational response for emergency scientific advice. So it would have triggered a number of
Yes.
cross-government agency responses.
Right. So it would open various
It would have opened
informative doors and so on. Yes, I
Indeed,
understand
yes,
that.
yes.
But at the end of opening the doors, as it were, what action on the ground would have been advised as a result of all this communication in terms of the clinicians?
Only from a clinician perspective. I've mentioned already that Dr. Dukes had made it clear that based on the signs and symptoms that he was seeing in the hospital, that they were being treated with, that the casualties were being treated.
I'll come back to that.
Okay.
I'll come back to that because it relates to the meeting in April. I'll come back to it. But if you were activating and opening all these doors to various departments because there was a risk, if no more, a risk that this was another nerve agent incident, however it arose, then there might be all sorts of practical things that clinicians should be considering rapidly. Do you
Would
agree?
like to suggest what they are, Mr. Mansfield, please?
Say sorry?
Would you like to suggest what they are?
Yes, well-
Can I just ask generally, are they?
Well,
Tell me what the difference is. Because at the moment, what I've had is they were being treated for
Yes.
anticholinesterase.
but if you understood that there was a risk that it wasn't organophosphate and that it was a nerve agent, then there are various tests that can be employed. Am I correct?
That's correct. And,
Right.
and that's the action that Dr. Dukes had undertaken already by sending samples to the Birmingham Poisons Unit, and also you'll
Right.
be able to ask Dr. Dukes next
Now-
week because he will have also spoken to the National Poisons Service.
Do you agree that in these circumstances where there's a possibility of a nerve agent, speed is of the essence, time is of the essence? Because you need to know early on whether it is nerve agent or whether it is a drug and so on.
Can I refer you to what I said a few moments ago, which was Dr. Dukes has assured me that they were being treated with the appropriate medical interventions at that point anyway.
All right, well then-
Pause, please. Look, I'm sorry. What you're being asked is whether, had you known this, there were differences in what ought to be being done to them at the hospital or by the hospital. Was there anything else that needed doing there and then, or not?
In terms of patient management,
Yes.
I don't believe so.
I see.
But of course, that's at the point that you discovered, but that sometime later, if early on, when first admitted to the hospital, clinicians were aware of the possibility of misdiagnosis, in other words, you confuse the two.
Yes.
At that stage, that would have been the stage at which you activate the various practical channels of testing exactly what it is. Do you follow my question?
Yes, I do.
And am I right?
You are right in that the hospital and the clinician in the hospital will telephone the National Poison Service, which I believe Dr. Dukes did, and alongside that, that triggers a discussion with the on-call UKHSA doctor, which would formalise a response.
Now, I just want to step back a bit before this. At the meeting where you took notes, that one,
Yes,
19th of April,
yes.
at Porton Down. Now, you've been asked a number of questions, but the question I have in relation to that meeting was, am I right in suggesting to you that despite all the discussion that took place on that day, none of it dealt with how you avoid the risk, or at least accommodate the risk of a misdiagnosis, does it?
I recall that meeting demonstrated the difficulties in making a diagnosis, because if you've heard from my clinical colleagues, the mixture of opiate toxidrome and cholinergic toxidrome is not that clear cut.
My question is really, was there any advice given at that meeting, as you're an advisor, about how a distinction might be made between the risk of an opiate poisoning as an overdose or a nerve agent poisoning?
That meeting highlighted the overlap between those signs and symptoms.
Yes. One final try, I'm sorry. The overlap may be identified, but resolving that for the people on the ground,
Yes.
in the hospital or pre-hospital,
Yes. Yeah.
wasn't really addressed, was it?
No, that's not true, because the highlighting of that overlap of signs and symptoms led to the update in the major incident guidance that Public Health England produced, which included an algorithm called CRESS. And CRESS is a toxidrome algorithm that helps with the diagnosis. And CRESS gives clinicians a clue as to whether it may be more likely to be an opiate or more likely to be a...
Right. Was that being used in this particular instance in the, I'm calling it the Amesbury
in
event?
Amesbury? No, it was not available
wasn't?
at that point.
Is that because people were not equipped to use it or didn't understand it or what?
Well, so the use of that diagnostic handrail
Yes.
has been used by NATO for a number of years,
Yes.
and is focused towards deliberate use in a war fighting scenario. But it's a useful clinical guide. So Ministry of Defence have pressed other agencies to adopt that handrail tool to aid in diagnosis of toxidromes.
So just again concentrating on the period between Salisbury and Amesbury, is it right that as far as information coming to you, leaving aside the question of the ambulance crews, were you ever informed during that period, either on the day that it happened or the day that you got to know about Amesbury, were you ever informed that the police in fact had no information about the use of drugs by Dawn Sturgess? Did you know that?
At that time, all the information I had been through Steve Jukes, so it was.
Yes, all right.
Yeah.
That's your answer, isn't it, Mr. Mansfield?
At the point of casualty attendance at the hospital, the only information I had was via Dr. Jukes.
I appreciate it, second-hand and so forth.
Yep.
But would you be agreeable to this proposition that you need as full a picture as possible, and if the full picture includes that, that would assist you, wouldn't it? Had you known? Had Dr. Jukes known?
Additional information
That's right.
would have assisted.
It would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Straw.
So, thank you very much. FT49, I'm Adam Straw, and I also ask questions on behalf of the family and partner of Dawn Sturgess on a different topic. So the main area of questions I'd like to ask you is about whether symptoms suffered by certain individuals were consistent with scenarios as to how they were contaminated by Novichok. So first, the Skripals on the 4th of March. We've heard that they left their house at around 1:30 p.m. on that Sunday afternoon, and the first symptoms they suffered were, in Julia's words, at least an hour and a half later, but they fell seriously ill shortly after, around about 3:35, so about 2 hours later.
That's my understanding, yes.
Simple question, is the timing and nature of their symptoms consistent with them being poisoned by Novichok when they came into contact with the front door handle at around 1:30 that afternoon?
What is the onset of signs and symptoms of in this forum? It's quite difficult to answer that. It may require.
You're being asked about the time difference.
I'd refer to evidence that is required in another setting to
Right.
enable to answer that question directly.
Then I'll mark that that's a topic which I must explore, and I'll do it at the appropriate time, Mr. Straub.
Thank you very much, and please do, if you're at all
Apologies.
concerned you might need to answer in close, please do so.
More than happy to answer it, but yes.
Thank you very much. I have two questions looking at it the other way round, and again, if that's your answer to these questions, please do say. We've also heard evidence that back on the Saturday, so on the 3rd of March, the Sergei Skripal touched the front door handle of his house in opening it to go into the house at about 6 p.m. or thereabouts. Now, can I ask, have you seen MK26's most recent witness statement dated the 4th of October 2024?
Oh, I have not.
Are you aware that in that statement, it's paragraph 36, MK26 expresses the view that it's highly likely that many lethal doses were on the front door handle of 47 Christie Miller Road? Are you
I'm aware of that concept, yes.
That concept.
And it doesn't surprise me that statement.
If that Novichok, so the many lethal doses, had been on the front door handle at 6 p.m. on Saturday the 3rd, when Sergei Skripal touched it, would one expect to see symptoms in Sergei Skripal earlier than the sort of 3 p.m., 3:35 p.m. mark on Sunday the 4th of March, 21 or so hours later?
I think I'd refer
Right.
in a different environment to share information that will support that more clearly.
Thank you. So in that context, I'm sure the third question will receive the same answer. It was going to be Maureen Cassidy, if she touched the door handle at that point.
Must follow, mustn't it, Mr.
Must do.
Straub? That's something that needs looking at, and it will be, but not here.
Thank you very much. I have similar questions about DS Bailey, PC Bell, whether their symptoms are consistent with the accounts that have been given of to how they may have come into contact with Novichok. I presume your answer is likely to be the same. Is it that you need to address that enclosed?
So I think I'm able to say a little something on those cases. Mm-hmm. So I think as I've mentioned earlier today, the dose is very important, and that dose, almost irrespective of dose, so at the point of exposure, there are delayed signs and symptoms. As I've mentioned already today, that dose does have an impact more on the severity of illness rather than the time to onset. And the time to onset will therefore be delayed. And that was the case for DS Bailey at his point of contamination and his clinical progression, as I understand, attending the emergency department, going home and then coming back again more unwell, because that was a dose-related effect, but the timelines were still over several hours.
My note, which may be wrong, so tell me, is that you're saying, as to Mr. Bailey, it's not so much time to onset as likely quantity of dose.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So dose is the important factor for all casualties. There is a delay in time to onset.
I'll try the question, but again, if it's better closed, please do say. DS Bailey described touching the front door handle as he went in and went out. He was wearing PPE, forensic suits and gloves. But we're going to hear from DI Mant later, whose statement says that the three of them had to raise their goggles when they were searching. He thought that was the potential for contamination of the face. Can you help in open whether the symptoms we see DS Bailey suffered are consistent with that sort of route of contamination in the early hours of the 5th of March?
It's likely that DS Bailey's exposure was a percutaneous exposure. The actual location of that percutaneous exposure may be different, maybe the face, maybe hands, maybe wrist, but his delay in presentation is consistent with a percutaneous exposure. I'm unable to say whether that contamination was face, neck, hands, or another area.
And similarly, PC Bell. Are you aware of PC Bell, who he is?
Please confirm for me, is this the gentleman who suffered a unilateral meiosis?
Yeah, he was one of the officers. He didn't go and search the property, but he was outside. And again, we're going to hear from him, but there's evidence that suggests he was handed a torch and some keys by the officers who went in.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with his case, but again, I'd be happy to look at that and give my view.
Okay. I think that's as far as I can take those questions. There's just one other topic.
It's helpful, Mr. Straw, thank you.
Just a very quick final topic, please. And I'd like us to look, please, at a document if we can. It's 4691. We saw it earlier. This is the report you drafted, I think, called included within the title, The Nerve of It.
Yeah.
And could you turn, please, to page 87 of that report?
This is what's being called the slideshow.
Yes.
Yeah.
If it's possible to zoom in on that, thank you. Can you help explain this table, please?
Yes, so at the point of writing these slides, again, I think it was ahead of the DSTL meeting.
It might help if I take you through it in stages. So do you see the first row,
Yeah.
number of casualties admitted?
Yes.
You see that? And does that indicate that there were 3 casualties admitted to hospital in the March incident?
That was my understanding, putting this, so that would have been Sergei, Yulia, and DS Nick Bailey.
We've heard about
Yeah.
the people who admit it, and then 2 in the July incident. We've heard about those.
Yes.
Then the next line, number of self-presenters to ED, is that the emergency department?
Yes, that's a number of people that would have attended the emergency department as worried about. And I can't recall where I got that figure from. It may well have been from Salisbury District.
Okay, thank you. And does that show that in the March incident there were 56 self-presenters to the emergency department?
If that's what I documented there, then that's my understanding.
And 31 for the July incident, self-presenting to the emergency department?
Again, yes, that's my understanding.
So
What's that? A list of people who thought they might be worried?
Yes,
Or
worried well, potentially, yes.
a total of 87.
Correct.
Thank you very much.
As a matter of interest, what's the third line? Or are you not concerned with that, Mr. Straw?
Perfectly good question, sir.
It may just be idle curiosity. Do you know what the third line is?
I don't recall, which is what makes me think that I would
we've got enough to be thinking
I would have got
about.
this clinically.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Straw. Anything else, Mr. O'Connor?
So no.
So thank you very much indeed for coming. Those are all the questions there are for you. There's no need to feel obliged to stay, though of course you're entitled to watch from elsewhere if you want to when we resume.
Thank you, sir.
Which we shall do on Monday at 10 o'clock. Under what form of regime, Mr. O'Connor?
It will be level 1.
Initially,
Monday morning.
level 1. Very well. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. I'll see you on Monday at 10 o'clock.
All rise.